Well, welcome to the WERA 103 presentation today. We're pleased to have Dr. David Tarkalson speaking to us today about nitrogen management in sugar beets in the Northwest. So David has a lot of experience in this and looking forward to his comments. This is one of a regular series of presentations made by the Western Extension and Research Activities Committee, and encourage you to come back regularly and view these presentations by regional experts. My name is Rob Mickelson. I work with the International Plant Nutrition Institute, and I'll be hosting the presentation today. Let me briefly introduce David Tarkalson. David is a native of Salmon, Idaho, in the United States. He received both his bachelor's degree and master's degree in agronomy from Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, and then received his PhD from North Carolina State University. Following his education, Dr. Tarkalson was employed as a professor at the University of Nebraska for about 5 years, and then in 2007, he moved back to Idaho and joined the U.S. Department of Agriculture with their Agricultural Research Service at the Northwest Irrigation and Soils Laboratory in Kimberly, Idaho. David works on a variety of soils and water topics, but his primary research areas include nitrogen management for sugar beets and corn, managing manure for sustainable crop production, and then managing scarce irrigation water for sugar beets and corn. So today, David's going to be talking about sugar beets and nitrogen management from some of his work in the Pacific Northwest. So with that brief and inadequate introduction, David, let me turn the screen over to you. Oops, sorry. And then you can go ahead and begin.
Okay, well, thanks, Rob. I appreciate that, and I appreciate this opportunity to spend just a few minutes today talking about nitrogen management, and particularly nitrogen management for sugar beet. So I work for ARS in Kimberly, Idaho, and one of the major crops in this area is sugar beets, and so that's kind of why I'm focused on that particular crop today. But I think today's conversation and discussion would be applicable to all crops. The more research information we gather, the more we understand about nitrogen management. It's important to realize that we can always be updating our knowledge and our practice of nitrogen management in all crops. And so I think it's important to look at sugar beets as kind of an example of this. And when I worked for the University of Nebraska, I also had the opportunity to focus on updating recommendations of nitrogen for corn, field corn as well. And so we found that that the continuous research and development of those recommendations are extremely important to not only the environment, but to the farmers and producers who are trying to be as economically viable as possible. And so on this slide, it kind of shows this practice of soil fertility and the 4R nutrient management strategy that IPNI and others have been fostering over the last several years, and really trying to match up these different components of sources of nutrients, rates, time, and place to do the best job we can to optimize crop yields, maximize profits of the producer, and minimize nutrient losses. So let's talk a little bit about sugar beets today in this context, but also understand that the same process is always going on in all crops. To give you a little bit of background, this is really showing you some of the most current fertilizer recommendations for sugar beets in the Pacific Northwest. And the University of Idaho has had a history of research, and more recently, my organization, the Agricultural Research Service, in conjunction with Amalgamated Sugar, which has their own research division, they have their own scientists that do really good work, replicated, valid scientific work, have continued to update those recommendations over time. And so this is just showing you kind of the example of that, what's been most recently published and is available. And this graph kind of shows you the different recommendations over the past, probably 25, 30 years or longer. So we historically in this area, our nitrogen recommendations are on a yield goal based approach, basically meaning that the more yield you're projected to receive, it requires basically a linear increase in nitrogen supply to that crop. And so you can see there's lots of variation in how that looks if you look at the yield goal versus the nitrogen recommendation. And it's important to realize this recommendation includes both applied nitrogen in combination with soil available nitrogen. And in this area, that is ammonium nitrogen and nitrate nitrogen. We found in our soils in these arid parts of the country and the world that ammonium is a significant contribution to nitrogen supply, whereas in other areas of the world where it's more humid, they don't necessarily take those into account, the ammonium into account, and it's typically just the nitrate. And again, you can see there's lots of variation here across these recommendations, and there's a reason why. And so I want to kind of maybe get into a little bit about why there's lots of variation in these recommendations over time. And I guess another point before I move on here too, it's important to understand that these recommendations are typically based upon research that's conducted in a narrow range of time. To give you an example, this particular recommendation relationship here is from the ARS Amalgamated Sugar Company's recommendations from a publication in 2016. But the research to get those recommendations were done during a time when the yield goals were within this range. And so they were between, say, 30 or let's say 70 megagrams per hectare up to about a little bit above 80 megagrams per hectare. And that's because that's what the sugar beets were yielding at that time during that research. And so when you try to extrapolate that outside of that range of yield, then with a yield goal based approach, you're putting on more fertilizer than was needed during that time. And the question is this added fertilizer needed? You need to put that on because your yields are higher. Well, these yield goal based approach say yes, but in reality, we don't necessarily know. We know that the nitrogen, this range of nitrogen here during the yields that were produced during that time of research are valid, but we have no idea whether or not putting on linear increases above that are needed or not. And so that's one of the issues we have with research and with these yield goal based approaches. This gives you an idea of the root yields we're experiencing in our growing area in the Pacific Northwest. This is actual data from the factories and from the fields, average yields over time. And we can see that, back in the early 70s, all the way up to about 2006, 2005 timeframe, we are increasing yields by about a little over a half a megagram per hectare per year. That's the slope of this line right here. So yields are going up. In about 2006, that's when our area and probably the other growing areas in the United States transitioned from the classic non-GMO sugar beets to the Roundup Ready sugar beets. And you can see since that time in the introduction of the Roundup Ready sugar beets, and not just that, it's also the combination of a new seed treatment like the Poncho Beta seed treatment at this time really helped increase this rate of increase over time to about 2.1 megagrams per hectare per year. And so that's a big difference. And so the yields we were getting at the time when we developed the last recommendations, and those recommendations were produced from about 2004, this period here, up to about 2011. So the yields in this range is what was occurring during that last research period from the last recommendations. But now we're hovering up here at about we're getting close to over 90 megagrams per hectare of root yield, and that's not slowing down. This last year we were about that same, maybe a little bit higher than that. And so typically in the past when people redo fertilizer recommendations for other crops, they use the fact that the recommendations were produced and developed at a lower yield level. And the question is, do you need different recommendations because we're now at a higher yield level? And that's really one of the justifications that's used across crops to justify funds and efforts into developing new recommendations. And the same thing holds true with sugar beets. So this gives you kind of an overview of the sugar beet growing areas in the United States and what they do for recommendations. And so we have lots of different approaches. We have static approaches where they basically don't adjust according to yield goal. They set more of a kind of a static to a range of nitrogen recommendations, irrespective of yield goal. And so one of the major growing areas in the United States, southern Minnesota, Minnesota, North Dakota, which would be called the American Crystal growing area, is the largest producer of sugar beets in the country. And they learned back in the mid 90s, early 90s, and don't quote me on this, but there was a transition. I talked to a fertility specialist out of that area not too long ago. But prior to a certain time back in the mid 90s or so, they were actually using a yield goal based approach. And from their research that they were conducting at that time, they realized that that wasn't working for them, that they didn't need to use that type of an approach to adequately supply their sugar beets with optimum nitrogen supplies. And so from that research, they went to more of a static nitrogen approach, where they're now recommending anywhere from 80 to 130 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And a lot of that depends on the location. Where they're growing the beets would depend on what rate they use. There's soils issues involved in that and a few other things. They'll change that static nitrogen recommendation based upon those criteria, not based upon yields. And then typically we have yield goal based approaches that have been used quite a bit across Idaho, Michigan, Montana, Nebraska, Wyoming. And typically what they do is they recommend supplying a certain amount of nitrogen per mass of sugar beets. And so I'm using the standard units here because they're well known amongst the growers here. But Idaho has been using a value of about 5.5 pounds of nitrogen per ton of beets, up to then they were using 7 on the sandier soils. But you can see that there's a range of what's going on across the country there. Let me give you a little bit of an example of the data from the American Crystal growing area. And this is the area that's in the Red River Valley of North Dakota. It's the major into Minnesota. It's the major sugar beet growing area of the country in terms of acres and amounts of beets produced as well. Their production system is much different than ours. Their rain-fed system, we're 100% irrigated in our area, but they found, and this data here really does show and justify their use of a static nitrogen approach. And so we can see the average sugar yields here in pounds per acre. Those yields are going up, as you can see, over time. So from the 80s up to about 2009, these are their average sugar yields across that time. And the blue represents, with this axis here, the total available nitrogen in pounds of nitrogen per acre. And this is pretty close to equivalent of kilograms per hectare as well, just a little bit lower than that. But what you see is, although the yields are going up, the amount of nitrogen, the supply, both the fertilizer in combination with what's in the soil, has basically stayed the same. Okay, and even some slight trends of that recommendation of that need going down, yet yields still going up. So they haven't necessarily seen a need to increase their nitrogen supply as the yield's going up. And so that they kind of saw this trend early on, and they're still seeing it now. Gives them confidence that their static N approach is is what's really needed there. The system is much more efficient than it used to be. As you can see, you combine these two things together, you start talking about efficiency, the nitrogen use. It's definitely getting better and better and better, and yields are going up using the same amount of nitrogen. Now, we don't have the type of data set in Idaho. They just barely started collecting this type of data maybe 2 years ago. And so the producers there always report their yield and their supply of nitrogen as well, both from the soil and fertilizer. And that's reported back to their co-op, the American Crystal. And they had this data to draw upon. In our area, they haven't had that historically. So to kind of get to the same understanding that we gather from this particular graph, we have to take a different approach, maybe with less data points. But I think it's telling, and it gives us a idea of where we can go from here. And so this is the data that I'm talking about. And so what I've got here is I got our recommended nitrogen supply over time. At the time, research was conducted for the recommendations that were developed. So for instance, Amalgamated Sugar Company developed recommendations based upon their research in 1977. And that research was conducted during this time frame down here, okay? And so at that time, the research told them that they were able to maximize sugar and root yields by supplying about 8 pounds of nitrogen per ton, okay? That was what the research was telling them. However, at that time, they were only producing about 21 tons per acre on average. That was the kind of the optimum maximum yields that were being produced across acres at that particular time. You multiply 21 by 8, and that gives you what we call this recommended nitrogen supply. As in this case, that's going to be around, about 160 pounds or so. If you multiply those two numbers together, I don't have my calculator, but that's what it ends up being. And so, and then in 1996, 94 time frame, the University of Idaho conducted research on 30 site years. And some site years had some issues, but many of them were pretty valid. And so they did that research to revise these recommendations that were being used for many, many, many years. Both the University of Idaho and Amalgamated Sugar have been recommending this 8 pounds of nitrogen per ton for many years, until the University of Idaho during the mid-90s decided we better check this out to see if we need to adjust these or not. And their research indicated that, well, now they only need about 7.3 pounds of nitrogen per ton, so which is less, and it's around 7 pounds is what they kind of came up with. This is the actual number averaged across the research site years, but they settled on the number of 7, and which is less than 8. So they said, okay, we need to decrease the recommendation to 7 pounds of nitrogen per ton. But at that time, the yields went from 21 tons to 26 tons per acre. Okay, when you multiply these two together, it's going to give you about 180, 190 pounds of nitrogen per acre total that's going to be needed, which wasn't too much different than what you had in 1977 in terms of an overall recommendation, okay, a total recommendation supply. You need to decrease your pounds per ton, but your tons are going up, which kind of balances itself out relative to what was going on before. Then in 2004, actually 2006 or so, around that time frame, the research group from Amalgamated Sugar decided, we're seeing some things in the field that are kind of would indicate that we don't need the 7 pounds per ton anymore. They were seeing some things, and so they decided to set up their own replicated research trials across some of their own ground and producers' ground as well. Most of this research was very well done. They replicated their treatments, these N-rate treatments, anywhere from 6 to 8 times. They were very robust and did a really good job in the research. They used proper statistical designs, blocking their study appropriately in the field, et cetera. It was really well done. When I first got here back in 2007, I also started doing some work on this as well independently. And so I developed several site years across several years. And then once I was done with that, I published some papers. But then I started developing this relationship with Amalgamated Sugar, and we decided we're gonna evaluate this data as one big data set. So we had like 13, I believe, site years of data. We put that together, looked at all the site years, and found that that based upon that data, we needed about 5.5 pounds of nitrogen per ton of beets to maximize yields, which was about 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds lower than what they got in 1997. And but at the time we were doing the research, the average yields were now, and in our studies as well, we're now around about 31 tons per acre. Okay, so you multiply those two together, then we're down here again at about 170 pounds of total available nitrogen needed to maximize yields. And so I started putting these together, this looking at what we're doing now, what was happening in the past, and how that all played out in terms of how much was total needed to be applied and supplied by the soil. And we're finding that it's within a very narrow range. Another way of looking at it's like this. We're going to look at with this graph versus a bar graph. And so we can see the root yields in Idaho and Oregon, the Pacific Northwest growing area, the average yields over time. And we can see that they're increased, as I showed before. I just put a quadratic line through this just to make it look a little cleaner. But if we look at the nitrogen requirement, that is the pounds of nitrogen or the mass of nitrogen per mass of beets, we can see that based upon the research, we can see in 1997 it was here. So we had a recommendation of 8 pounds per ton of beet, but our yields were 21 tons, right? If you go 1995, 1996, the University of Idaho's recommendations, they dropped based upon the research to around 7 at this yield level. Ours dropped to about 5.5 at this yield level. And so when you multiply these two things together to get your nitrogen, your mass per acre, it ends up looking like this. Okay, basically a straight line, or at the very least, a very narrow range. And in this case, a range of about 20 pounds per acre of nitrogen range here. And so as you look at this, the trend is, and the logic is that our supply of nitrogen, the amount of nitrogen we needed to maximize our yields, is not necessarily tied to the yield. Okay, we don't need to be putting in more and more nitrogen as yield goes up. We need to be supplying a certain optimum range of nitrogen to maximize yield. The reason why our nitrogen supplies were going down is because the sugar beets basically needed a optimum range of nitrogen, and it was not necessarily tied to the yield, which makes us believe and lean toward using a static nitrogen approach in our production system. Get this thing to move on here. Now, one of the problems you end up having is, and we found this is the issue. So you develop recommendations in a given year. If you keep using that same recommendation, so let's say in this case, 8 pounds per, or say this is due megagrams per hectare. So this is actually 4 megagrams per hectare per megagram of beet. If you keep using that same recommendation over time, when the yields are going up, this is what happens. You end up recommending nitrogen at a supply that's much higher than what you actually need. The only way to keep this type of use a yield goal based approach is if you have continuous research going on every year that keeps adjusting a recommended value so that you keep this where it needs to be in the optimum range. But because we know we don't have the money, the time, the resources to be doing continuous nitrogen rate research, we have to look at an approach that would help us keep from over applying nitrogen over time. This is just to give you a little better view of the latest research that was done. This is the 13 site years of data that I was talking about earlier that the university, Amalgamated Sugar Company and ARS did. And it also shows you for each of those different site years what the nitrogen supply was needed to maximize root yield. Okay, and so what we can see here is that for the most part, most of these there's lots of variation. Of course, you go all the way up to about, say, about 225 kilograms per hectare needed to maximize yield, all the way down to a little bit over 100. Lots of variation. Okay, but the one thing that's noticeable is this amount of nitrogen to maximize yield is much less than what would have been needed if we were using a yield goal based approach based upon the existing data we had. So at this time, we're talking during this particular period of time, this is back in 2005 to 2011. At that time, we were using the recommendation of 7 pounds per ton of 7 pounds of nitrogen per ton of beet, about 3.5 kilograms of nitrogen per megagram of beet. And if we kept using that recommendation, our average yields this time were about 35 tons per acre. And if you multiply that by, say, 7, we would have been recommending a producer, if they were using the recommendations, we've been putting on about 245 to 250 pounds of nitrogen, which is way above the ceiling of this graph. And we're seeing that we need to apply much less than that. And so, as a researcher and as someone who doesn't want to recommend undersupplying nitrogen, we drew a line, say, here at 200. And we are basically saying that for most producers on most of our ground and our types of soils, that you don't necessarily need to be putting on more than, say, 200 pounds of total available nitrogen per acre, or about 225 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. That would be our ceiling. And just to show you some of these higher site years in terms of what was needed, these are some of our sandier sites as well. So we can definitely see that in some of our systems where we don't retain as much the water as well, thus the nitrogen, it's a little less efficient system. You need to be close to the 200, but more of our heavier textured soils, it can be much less than that, actually. So in 2016, Amalgamated Sugar started gathering data from all of their producers, every single one of the producers. And of course, this is a co-op. So the growers actually own the company. And so because of that, they were able to get in agreement and start supplying not only the yield. The company always knew the yields from each field, but now we also were able to team that up with, okay, how much nitrogen did you supply, both in terms of what you had in your soil from the soil test and what you put on with fertilizer. They're able to combine that together into a total nitrogen supply. And so you can actually see in 2016 how those matched up. So you can see the yields they got and how much nitrogen they put on each of those fields. And we can see if we draw a line at, say, 225 kilograms per hectare or 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre, which is the ceiling I talked about earlier, we can see that basically 90% of the producers were putting on nitrogen in excess of that. And in most cases, a lot more nitrogen than that. Okay. And there, of course, there's lots of other factors going in here that are confounding this type of analysis, but there was really no linear increase that the more nitrogen you put on, the more yield you're going to get. And so what was telling to us and to the Amalgamated Sugar is that, if 200 is a very liberal number in terms of nitrogen supply, most producers are putting on way more than need to be put on. And so I actually had to exclude DOT. So if there was a field that had over 200 pounds or 225 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare just in the soil itself without fertilizer, I removed that from this data set. So this is only showing you people that had less than the 225 and either didn't add nitrogen or did add nitrogen, okay? And so all these people on the right-hand side of this line here had applied nitrogen to move over that line. And I guess one thing that's important to understand to the audience today is in sugar beets, nitrogen management is extremely important, not just because of the economics and the environmental component of it, but in sugar beets, there's a very strong relationship between oversupplying nitrogen and decreasing quality of the sugar beet. And when you start decreasing quality, we're talking about increasing the impurities in the root. There's nitrogen compounds that are impurities, and it costs a lot of money to get those impurities out. And you also end up losing a lot of the sugar in your beet to molasses, which we have a very difficult time recovering sugar from that molasses. And so you're basically losing money because of decreased quality of your sugar beet. And so it's an incentive within the sugar beet industry to minimize the impurities. And the one way they can do that is to better manage nitrogen. So there's this really fine line between undersupplying nitrogen and affecting yield, and oversupplying nitrogen too much, so you're decreasing quality. And so there's a big incentive to be kind of in that optimum zone. And so that's why they're very concerned about nitrogen management in sugar beet and spend a lot of time trying to understand it better and revise it. Now, if you go back, this is some more data from the survey, from the data set from 2016, from the fields of all the growers in the Pacific Northwest. What I'm showing you here now is just what was available in terms of nitrate nitrogen and ammonium nitrogen in that 3-foot profile. This actual data set only includes nitrate nitrogen down to 3 feet and ammonium nitrogen in the top foot, okay? And so you can see the range of available nitrogen, and this is kilograms of nitrogen per hectare in this column. This is the standard units here. But you can see that, and the percent of fields, of the 730 fields that were included in this analysis, and what percent of those fields fall within each of these ranges. And we can see that if we kind of get in here to this 224, 225 being kind of the optimum amount or less, being the maximum amount, I should say, that you want to supply, that a big chunk of the fields, close to 2/3 of those fields, were at that or below. Okay, so could potentially utilize some fertilizer. Okay, and in my mind, the way I look at it this way, I'd say that anybody that's in this range here would probably not need to apply fertilizer or apply very minimal fertilizer, because they're kind of in the sweet zone of available nitrogen already. If you're close to this range here and you had this really sandy soil, then it might be good to put some on, possibly based upon the research. But I kind of look at this zone here as 23% of the fields that fell in this zone don't need to be putting any fertilizer on, and anything above that for sure don't need to be putting fertilizer on. And so there's quite a few acres here, percentage of acres that fall within this optimum to excessive zone already with just the soil nitrogen. About half of the fields fell within a zone where they didn't need to be putting fertilizer on. The other half could use fertilizer. And so this goes to show you just how important soil sampling is in our area. For whatever reason, for reasons we don't understand yet fully, although our soils are relatively low in organic matter, so we're talking 1 to 1.5% organic matter, our soils have a tendency to mineralize a lot of nitrogen, both during a growing year or a fallow year over the winter. We just seem to have a lot of nitrogen being made available to a crop, and the variation in that is also highly variable. So you can have some years where less is mineralized compared to other years, and that range can be very large. And so it really kind of confounds us trying to supply the perfect amount of nitrogen fertilizer that's needed that in a particular year, because that range can be so great. But for a majority of our fields, there's lots of mineralization that's occurring during the growing season as well, which confounds things even more, because that is taking place after our soil test is being completed. So our producers need to pay attention and need to soil sample and need to have confidence that if they fall within this range here, that they don't have to be putting on fertilizer. And that's a very difficult thing for our producers to understand, because they have a culture of putting fertilizer on crops every year, at least something. And if you're in this half of the acres that don't need to do that, you've got to trust the data. You really got to trust the system to do that, and that's difficult. And I think that leads to some of the over fertilization that we see in this area, is that people still think, oh, I still got to put on at least 100 pounds. I mean, I need to put 100 pounds on, right? And so that type of mentality is still prevalent, which leads to this graph earlier. If I go back here real quick, this mentality of putting on fertilizer, particularly up in this area. So most likely these people came back with fairly high soil tests, which indicated they didn't need to put anything on, but they still put fertilizer on. Get back where I was here real quick. So something we're thinking of now is this, and just to give you a little bit of background before I go into this, we are now working with Amalgamated. We have, I believe, 5 to 6 site years this year. We're evaluating this particular concept. We're actually doing a very detailed nitrogen rate study this year across our state, and probably do it next year as well, to really say, okay, if we're really going to recommend this heavily, we got to make sure that we're saying the right things. And so we're evaluating whether this is true or not by using continued N-rate studies for the next couple of years. But we really do believe, based upon our analysis and our logical approach, that a static nitrogen recommendation is a valid approach that we need to look at in our area. We recommend, and this is what was used in our approach, a soil test down to 3 feet, including both nitrate nitrogen and ammonium nitrogen in that analysis. So we recommend the preliminary recommendation, no more than 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre on our heavier textured soils. And that is equivalent to about 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare on our heavier soils. And that goes from sandy loams all the way up to clays. Our sandy loams act very similar to our silt loams here in this area. And no more than 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre, or 224 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare on our really coarse soils, our loamy sands to sands. And our heavier soils, if we have very shallow soils. We do have soils here that are close to the canyon, above basalt, volcanic rock, that can be very shallow, and those will definitely be a less efficient system, and so they could probably bump that up to this range. So I think it's important, just for a couple more slides real quick, to kind of elaborate on this soil supply of nitrogen, to look at, okay, how important is the soil in our area? How it lends weight to the importance of doing a good job of soil sampling, which I think our producers need to improve on, but I really think they're doing a much better job now, especially the sugar beet growers, for sure, because of the situations with nitrogen and how it affects the industry. So this is some data from about 106 soil cores down to 6 feet, or about 1.8 meters. They were sampled at 0.3 meter increments, all the way down to 1.8 meters. And the textures range from sand to silt loam. We're talking beach sand over in the potato growing areas of Fort Hall, by Pocatello, Idaho, where the most potatoes are grown, all the way across the state to some of our silt loams as well. And so what we have here is, by depth, we have the kilograms of nitrogen per hectare of both ammonium nitrogen ammonium nitrogen and nitrate nitrogen, and the percent of the nitrogen across the profile that's located at each depth. There's two things going on here that I think are important. The first thing is there can be significant amounts of nitrogen all the way down to 1.8 meters, as you can see. If you look, we all know, and it's pretty common knowledge that most of your nitrogen is going to be located in the top foot, or most of your nutrients are, right? That's where it's put on. That's where a lot of your microbial activities occurring, mineralization is going on. And so that's where it's going to be. So in this case, we have about a third of the total nitrogen in that profile, both in terms of nitrate, nitrogen, ammonium nitrogen are located in the top foot, okay? So that's something we expected to see. Now let's go down to the second foot down to the, I say second foot down to the 6 foot, but you get the metric system down here from 0.3, 0.6 down to about 1.8. If you look at both either at ammonium or nitrate, there's not much difference to go down to the profile, okay? You don't see this drastic decline in the amount of nitrogen as you go down depth, which is very interesting to us. We encouraging producers to go to 3 feet has been a big jump, okay? Sampling to 3 feet's been a big jump for us in this area. But to know that you have quite a bit of nitrogen deeper in the profile was kind of a revelation to us. So that's one thing I wanted to point out from this graph. The second one is in our system, ammonium is a major supplier of nitrogen to our crops, and so we have to account for this here. We can't just ignore that. And in the past, amalgamated sugar has not been accounting for the ammonium nitrogen in the second and third foot. But I think that we're on board now to do that. In our research studies, we've always looked at that and include that in the analysis. So that's another important point to look at here as well. We do know from some water uptake data we have that the deeper you go in the soil, the less efficient or the less ability the roots have to extract nitrogen. So you can't say, okay, this 15% or this 25, this let's say 18 kilograms of nitrogen is going to be is the equivalent to the nitrogen down in this depth. That's not true. Because of gravity and other physiological characteristics of the plant, they're not going to have access to as much of this nitrogen as they would be in the second foot. So there's definitely a factor there, and that really prevents us from saying, okay, you need to sample down to 1.8 meters here to account for the nitrogen, because less and less nitrogen is going to be available to the plant the deeper you go in the profile, for sure. But we do know that in sugar beets, we have data indicating that from water extraction data that, and I want to get these numbers right here, but I believe it is said that, and I think I have something open here that will tell me this. I brought this up so I could demonstrate this particular. Excuse me. I'm going to bring this up on the other thing here. I want to tell you the right numbers here. I'm going to move this over my other screen so I'm not messing up my screen. But this is new data, and we're finding that in sugar beets can, in the top 1.5 meters, so this depth right here up, that's where 80% of the soil water is extracted from to raise sugar beets in our area. They'll extract so 80% of the total water that's used by the sugar beet plant. If you just drop down to 1.8 meter, that's where 95% of the water. So 15% of the water the sugar beet crop needs is coming from this 1.5 to 1.8 meter depth. And so there is still considerable amount of water being taken up, and as a consequence, where the water goes, the nitrate goes. So I think a lot of our quality issues in our area from excess nitrogen uptake that was not predicted could be to deep soil nitrogen that we're not testing. We don't understand what's down there. Okay. But the last point I want to bring up with this data is this, and that is it's important to do a good job of soil sampling. And so we recommend that we sample to about 0.9 meters at 1 foot increments, and we test for both nitrate and ammonium to give us an understanding of what's going to be available in our soils. And with that, I want to say thank you. I apologize if I was rambling around, but hopefully the main points were brought forward, and it allows you to understand the importance of continuously understanding through research what our crops need, how they're obtaining it, the dynamic nature of our systems in terms of nitrogen management, so that we can kind of couple those things together to do a better job of supplying nitrogen and really trying to hone in on that rate component of the 4R stewardship. Is what's the right rate? And that really is, I believe, the king of the 4Rs, because it really, the amount of nitrogen we apply is a big component to both the economics, to the quality of the crop, and to our environmental stewardship as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Tarkalson. You've sure brought up some interesting topics and changed the perspective of how we view fertilizer recommendations for sugar beets. So people that are interested in learning more information, feel free to contact Dr. Tarkalson, and maybe he can help you answer those questions. So with that, thank you, Dr. Tarkalson. And for the viewers, we look forward to having you participate in future WERA 103 webinars. So thank you, and goodbye for now.